Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we are going to take a look at how to read the contents of a text file using a new object called FileReader. This video assumes that you've been following along with the fundamentals demo and have already worked with the FileWriter object. And if anything, you want to start to see some of the parallels between the two. We're going to focus on our file reader in this video, and we're going to take a look at a couple of different ways how to read or import data into our application. And so to begin with, what we want to do is scroll down below your main, and we're going to create a little helper function that will allow for us to demo our file reader, and we're simply going to call it FileReaderDemo. Now, it's going to be pretty simple. It's not going to accept any input argument. It's also not going to return any output arguments. So if anything, all we need is a public static void, and we're going to simply call this one FileReaderDemo. And again, it's not going to accept any input arguments. Just out of habit, we want to go ahead and create our comment block up top, and then put a little note here of what we're trying to do. So the idea here is that we're going to use a file reader to get the contents of a text file. Now, we're not going to be limited to text files, but for this example, we're going to focus just on a plain ASCII text file so that you can sort of see the similarities to C and C++. So to begin with, what we want to do is we want to create two objects. The first one is going to be of type java.io.file, and we're going to call it our input file. The second one is going to be of type java.io.fileReader, and we again are going to use a rather verbose file name, or a variable name rather, and we're just going to call this input file reader. Now, the idea here is that we would ultimately like to use our input file and our input file reader together. But if anything, what I want to do is show you a little bit of variety here. And if anything, I'm going to show you a less than desirable way of going about doing this. And we're going to make some improvements as we go along. So what we want to do first is we're actually going to go ahead and hard code in the name of the file that we wish to open. You see, there's really no way to get it from our function signature, and it's not really worth it to us to put a scanner in place. And so if anything, what we're going to do for this example is we're simply going to say input file reader is going to be equal to new java.io.fileReader. And if you'll notice, we've got a few overloads here. And specifically, we're going to focus on the first and the third overload. Now, ultimately, we would like to use the first one, which accepts a file object. But for a little bit of variety, again, I would like for us to see how to do this with a string. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to use the third overload where we pass it a string. Now, note here that there is no requirement to specify the way the file is being opened, like in the file writer. File writer, we were concerned with possibly writing or appending. In this case, we're only going to be reading, so there's fewer overloads. And we're just going to go ahead and hard code in a name of a fictitious file called sample.txt. Now, right off the bat, you should notice that you're actually getting an error/warning here, and that basically we have not wrapped this initializer or constructor rather inside of a try-catch block. Remember that you have to do that whenever you're doing file IO in Java. And so what we'll do is we'll start with our try, and we're going to catch a generic exception. We'll talk more about exceptions in later videos. And then inside the try branch, we'll simply paste our constructor. Now let's take a second to clean up some of the extra white space that we've accrued here. And then before we go too far, always remember that it's a good idea to go ahead and put in the line that would close your file. Just like in C, when we open a file, we want to make sure to remember to close it. And then under the catch portion, we need to do something with the exception that we may have accidentally thrown. And the easiest thing to do is to do a system.out.println. Accidentally hit the wrong tab there. And a error message that says failed to open file. And then again, another system.out.println line. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to leverage the toString method of our exception. Now, at this point, what we want to do is understand how our file reader is going to help us. And so to do that, one of the things we can do is just by typing in input file reader dot, and then let's explore some of the methods that are available to us. And you can see there's our close. We can talk a little bit more about the notify and notify all that gets into asynchronous behavior. But the one that we're most interested in is going to be this set of reads. So we have a read char buffer, a read of a char array, and so on. And the one that we're the most interested in for the purpose of this particular video is the read, the parameterless read. And if you'll notice here, it returns a output value of integer type, or specifically a primitive, and a -1 if the end of stream has been reached. And so the idea here is that very much like your C and C++ when you were doing file IO, you're going to read the contents of the file character by character until you reach the end of file. And in this case, our read method for our input file reader will simply return a -1 if the end of the stream has been reached. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is notice that this is of int type, and we want to create a new local variable that we're simply going to call chunk. And the idea is that it is going to be of type integer, and it's going to be where our input file reader stores the return value from attempting to read a character out of the file. And so we'll simply say chunk is equal to input file reader dot read. And the idea is that we want to do this while the return value is not equal to -1. So what we can do here is we can simply set this up as a while loop. We'll use a couple of nested parentheses, make sure that they match. And while the value returned from the input file reader from the read method that has been stored in the chunk variable, while that value is not equal to -1, then we simply continue to read and write, or print rather, values. And so at this point, all we're going to do is a system.out.print. Now we're going to do something just a little bit different. Previous videos and also in this method as well, we have been doing print lines. Just for a little bit of variety, I want us to go ahead and throw in our printf statements. Now, hopefully you're familiar with the printf from a programming language. In this case, what I want us to see is that the behavior is very, very similar in that we provide the first argument as the format specification. In this case, since I know it's going to be an integer that I'm going to be printing, I'm going to specify %d followed by a colon and then a %c. And the idea is that I simply want to print out the numeric value of the chunk as well as the character that it represents. And so if nothing else, let's put a couple of notes here that this is going to be an integer and %c is going to be the char. And just again, another little note here, a quick reminder of your ASCII conversion between integers and chars. If you're not familiar with either that or these formats, I highly encourage you to go take a look at some of my videos that focus on it. With the C language, there's very little differences between the two. At this point, we're pretty much ready to test our little helper function. So go ahead and build it. Verify that we have no errors in our code so far. And then you want to go back up to your main, and we're simply going to add another branch of our ever-growing if, else, if. And so in this case, what we want to have is else if, and if our argument length is equal to 1, and our args square brackets 0 equals ignore case. And in this case, we are, of course, just going to keep it consistent with the function name, and we're going to call this one our file reader demo. Again, you can get more sophisticated if you want to. You can pass a file name from the command line, and all that's for future versions and future work on your part. Well, instead, what we would simply like to do is call our EE333.FundemantalsDemo.FileReaderDemo. Go ahead and build it one more time. And come out to your command window. You'll notice I'm already in my classes folder. So all I have to do is call Java with my EE333.FundemantalsDemo class. And then as a switch, my file reader demo. And you'll notice that I get an exception. The application didn't technically crash on it. We did handle the exception in that we printed a message to the user that said error, failed to open file, as well as the toString output of the exception itself. And you can see here that it's basically telling us that it cannot find that particular file. Well, that's great. That gives us an opportunity to see how to go about fixing this. So the first thing that you want to do is go find your classes folder. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a new text file. I'm going to go ahead and call it sample.txt. And as contents of this sample.txt file, I figure it would only be fitting if we used the contents of the Wikipedia page about Java. So I'm going to copy and paste as text into the text file. Going to go ahead and save it. And then come back here to our command window, rerun it, and you should now get results. And you'll notice here that basically what I'm getting is two pieces of information. One is going to be the numeric value of the character, followed by its character symbol, if you would, according to the ASCII conversion. And again, if you're not familiar with the ASCII table, I highly encourage you to look it up, get familiar with the mapping. We're just going to be using simple character sets for these examples, so that will be fine. There are other character sets, of course, that you can use. And then one more thing that we might as well go ahead and throw in this just so that we can make it a little more useful. I'm going to go ahead and create a new variable, also of type int, and I'm going to call it count. And in this case, I am going to go ahead and initialize it to 0. And then inside of our while loop, we're simply going to increment the count. And then after we close the file, we're going to have a system.out.println, or for that matter, we could also use our format where we simply do count over %d and a new line, and then we'll store the count variable. Again, I'm going to build it, come back to the command window, rerun it. Now you should see that we have 1,692 characters in that file. But wait, we've forgotten something. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that we would like to ultimately use that input file. And also, we don't want to use exception throwing and catching as a way of handling the logic. So what we would like to do, instead of directly creating the input file reader from the hard-coded file name, what we can do now, whether it's inside or outside the try-catch block, doesn't really matter because this particular function won't mind. But what we can do is we can go ahead and create a new java.io file. And in this case, here is where we want to go ahead and still hard code the sample.txt. But then what we're going to do is we're going to use a little bit of logic here that checks to see first if the input file exists. And if it does, then we want to attempt to open it. So effectively what you do now is you simply push all of the code that you had previously written inside the true branch of our if statement. Seem to have gotten my tabs off just a little bit. There we go. And then under the else, we can have a little bit more graceful handling, if you would, of the lack of the file. And by that, I mean, we can just simply have a system.out.println. This says error or even warning, file does not exist. And hopefully you can see now the difference between us handling this in logic versus catching an exception. Basically, the first way is better because you're sort of predicting what could happen. Exceptions should fundamentally only be used when it's some truly unpredictable or unexpected behavior. At this point, then we will change our constructor for our input file reader. And we'll use the other overload that was specified in the file reader that uses a file object or our input file object. At this point, the behavior of our function is essentially the same until the file itself does not exist. And so in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to leave our sample.txt in place. We're going to run it. You'll see that once again, I find 1,692 characters, but I'm going to play a little trick on our application in that I'm just simply going to add a character here or two onto our file name. So in other words, basically our sample.txt no longer exists. And the application still exits early, but it does so gracefully. In other words, we control when it exits simply by printing out the error message, the file does not exist. Again, we can simply go back, change our sample_01.txt to sample.txt, and we are back in business of reading our file. Now, keep in mind, now this is character by character, and so that's sort of one of the benefits and also the downsides of our input file reader is that it really gives us full control of how we want to read the characters in from the file. And so many times you'll find this useful. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.